thought maybe we'd start with some of the elements of regime change, color revolution that we were touching on in the Servando Gonzalez text, because he was, as we said, an intelligence analyst for Latin South America for many years, and he understands the power of the global elite, and he comes at it from a somewhat Christian perspective, I think, because he understands that the revolutions were against throne and altar, so he understands the longer Masonic plan to overthrow the monarchies and to install revolutionary governments. And he's also very critical of the whole Castro regime. He's aware of the fact that Castro appears to have banished Guevara as an action that aligned with some of the global elites, particularly people at the Council on Foreign Relations, who seem to have always had some sort of affinity with Castro and protection for Castro. Of course, many of the people at the CFR, as we know, are Fabian socialists. They're not Marxists per se. They're not Soviets. They're socialists of a certain flavor, the socialism that believes in uniting with monopoly capital. And he starts off by saying Marxism is really a tool. It's a tool that won't allow society to function in a normal way. It must subvert society. Marx's theory of imperialism provides the best framework for an understanding of a temporary U.S. war drive. In fact, James Petrus wrote in his book, Rulers and Rule of the United States, that the neoconservative basis itself for its philosophy is, in fact, Marxism. The neoconservatives, as you may recall, are all Trotskyites. So Trotskyism is the real basis of neoconservative imperialism and warmongering. And it's a kind of large-scale deception that's involved in making people think that you either support the IMF and its free market liberties in Latin and South America, or you, by default, support Marxism. So again, you either get, do you want Coke and Pepsi, or do you want Maduro? And what we saw, I think, recently is, of course, that the real reason that Maduro was removed was because of the desire for, number one, resources, and number two, because of criticism of the nation state of Israel, as Israel itself bragged. He goes on to talk about the true intelligence that is necessary to understand the world order. It involves a lot of history and involves a lot of declassified documents. And that's the real story that you don't get from the controlled magic circle of mainstream media that keeps you within a very defined, a very limited scope of understanding what's going on. The revolution is, in fact, from above. And he talks about the Fabians and Antonio Gramsci, that there would be a long march to the institutions to capture those institutions to bring about world order. And as you know, I've read tons of books from the global elite themselves, probably about 70 now, maybe more, that deal with their desire and plans to construct a world order over the last 100 years. And the means that by which they do that are primarily banking and the banking power and structure, the corporate structure, and the intelligence agencies that work hand in glove with the corporate banking structure. They are, in fact, the major funders of many revolutions, and including leftist revolutions. And I was first introduced to the pre-OSS and CIA institution of the inquiry through Servando Gonzalez's book. The first chapter or second chapter deals with the inquiry, the predecessor to the OSS and CIA, and how one of the planks of their strategy at the time of Woodrow Wilson was things like free trade. And so basically this book, although it is written from a critical of the New World Order perspective, it's a great take on Quigley and other texts that align with the thesis of Quigley in those texts. The idea for the inquiry, who made up many of the early members of the Council on Foreign Relations, was to create a government that would be by experts. And so really the entity, the inquiry, and then the CFR, which came out of the inquiry, they are above the State Department. They're the entity that's hidden in plain view that tells the government and the elected officials what to do. And because we never focus on that and never talk about that, that's why things never change. And that's not antithetical to the influence of APAC or something like that. Those things often worked together. So to think of this, oh, he won't talk about Israel. No, these things are all part and parcel. The CFR, for the most part, will support these kinds of attitudes that many Zionists and people like that want. So they're really the same thing. There were 14 points that were passed under the Wilson administration, as we know, leading to Wilson's 14 points led to the Federal Reserve Act and the Americanism of that time, which was really just Council on Foreign Relations socialism. As we know, they tried to create the League of Nations. That didn't work. And he goes on to talk about the Council on Foreign Relations itself, that they began very early figuring out how to recruit. And they didn't recruit in a secret way. They recruited in a somewhat public way. So talent spotters would work for the CFR, and they would find people of interest when they were young. They would test them and they would select them. They even have case officers to begin the recruitment process. In the case of the CFR, people are probably groomed for that from a youngish age. We know, for example, recently that you've seen Angelina Jolie, you've seen even people in Hollywood, right? George Clooney, right? They've all been members and worked with the CFR. And another one of these institutions is the United Nations, as you know, which Trump has supposedly removed us from today. So at least one good action amongst many failed actions in the last few months from Trump. But they also talk about how many CFR members make up both presidential candidates for many elections, which is shows this sort of false left-right perspective. So to understand the false left-right dialectic that we all know about in this audience, we're not going to rehearse all of that. It helps to understand the Council on Foreign Relations as kind of the central entity above the State Department and above the elected officials that manage that fake dialectic. And again, it still never gets talked about. People never discuss this. It just gets dismissed because everyone falls into getting back into the drama of whatever's happening in the political realm this week. So if you want to know who is behind the overthrow of America, and it's more than just Israelis, it's more than Zionists, because these people have been at work before there were large power blocks of AIPAC and others involved in the U.S. government. There is this supra entity, which itself traces back to the Rothschilds. So we're not escaping that influence by talking about the CFR. We're in fact talking about an entity that comes out of Rockefeller and Rothschild alliance to support and create these supra-governmental, supra-national institutions and think tanks and steering committees. He goes on to say, as F. William Engdahl does, somebody who comes from a more left perspective, the same thesis. So right-wing and left-wing analysts both coming to conclusions that really the CIA ends up being the private army of the Rockefellers. They are Rockefeller spies initially. And he even has a good critique, I think, of Darwinism. He points to Darwinism as a huge impact on the West to erode the traditional structures and to give the idea, the impression that, well, why can't we just evolve to a world government, right? If we have a world government, we won't have wars. I mean, it's so low tier and stupid, but that's literally what almost all of the global elite writings point to. That's what they talk about. They talk about essentially we won't have war anymore when we disarm the nations. And if you remember, Gaudium et Spes, the important Vatican II document, which Leo just said is still binding, is still authoritative. He reiterated that. That's the seventh reiteration of Vatican II being binding and authoritative. Remember, Gaudium et Spes says that we will disarm the nations and create a global government along the lines of the United Nations and UNESCO. So, you can go watch my talk on Gaudium et Spes to be reminded of that. He then moves on to talk about some of the regime changes that kicked off early with the CIA, obviously in 1952-53 with the Shah of Iran, and that was Chase Bank was really one of the major players, as well as the Seven Sisters oil cartel. And then he points out something very curious that nobody ever talks about, which was number one, Castro, if you don't know, was an actor. Did you know that Fidel Castro was in movies? And before he ascended to be communist dictator of Cuba, you can actually go to Castro's IMDb. And I think he also tried out for the Dodgers. And it's fun to highlight this because most people don't know this. So look at this. Oh, what do you know? Fidel Castro. Wait, what? He has a IMDb? Sure. Well, what movies was he in? Well, he was an actor in a movie in 1986, but if we go back to his acting credits, he was in trying out for movies as a extra in Easy to Wed. Here's one. Cuban Rebel Girls. Here. So he was in a Lucille Ball movie as an extra in 1946. He was in a Errol Flynn movie, interestingly, as an extra as well. Now, I'm not saying that Fidel Castro is not a real person and that he's a CGI created, but there's probably some level of cooperation. And that's because early on, he actually worked for the banks in Angola. Castro's soldiers protected the refineries in Cabinda from saboteurs, and Castro was paid in US dollars for these services. Half of the production of Gulf oil in Angola ended up in US refineries. The consortium of De Beers, which controlled the diamond mines, but here the consortium of oil cartels were even making use of Castro. What was the result of Castro's victory in Angola? Months after he took control of the city, Angola became the U.S.'s largest commercial partner in Africa. Chase Bank, Bankers Trust, Citibank, and Morgan Guarantee gave huge loans to Angola. Another example of CFR involvement here is the infamous National Security Study Memorandum 200 by Kissinger, which was actually a product of the CFR. National Security Memorandum 200 was concerned with depopulation of the continent of Africa, of course, but nothing exemplifies better the implementation of this than Castro's invasion of Angola in 1975. Despite all the disinformation that appeared in the American mainstream media, it was not a Soviet invasion, and it was the U.S. that benefited from Castro's invasion. Like all intelligence operations and agencies, the main job of the CFR is to recruit spies and agents of influence as a way to infiltrate other organizations that they would like to control. One of the key tools and outlets here has been the Rhodes Scholarship and the London School of Economics. And this is how we got Bill Clinton recruited into the CFR as a Rhodes Scholar. And of course, everybody's familiar with Whitewater and the Mena, Arkansas drug running, a la the Clintons, et cetera. So really it's NGOs, think tanks, foundations that run things, and they are above the State Department and the elected officials. But we seem to have forgotten that because, at least at times, Trump kind of acts like, maybe like Reagan did, a bit of a loose cannon, but then Trump also kind of never fails to disappoint. So, what is the CIA? It is the privatized army of the Fortune 500. That is what the CIA has been called for many decades, and of course that makes perfect sense. So, that is really the background here. That's what's going on. In regard to the Panama Canal, he argues that the Panama Canal was a PSYOP revolution. And I don't even know what to believe about the Panama Canal stuff. So I think that it really makes the most sense to just understand that all wars have been wars for resources. All wars have been wars for some form of empire, probably, for the most part, at least the modern era, at least. He says that It was not until the administration of Teddy Roosevelt that an American president systematically made active use of intelligence for foreign policy. Roosevelt was a pioneer of covert action. He sent intel operatives to Panama to incite a revolution that he would use as a pretext to justify the American world order and the annexing of the territory of the Panama Canal. In 1907, Roosevelt also relied on intelligence, which indicated the growing military buildup in Japan as justification for the worldwide cruise of the Great White Fleet, which was to display U.S. naval muscle to the rest of the world. This is also when you get the origins of the FBI, the Bureau of Investigation, at this time in the early 1900s, 1908 to 1916. By 1916, they end up with 300 agents. In Imperium, you need all of these agents and operatives. So that's where we are with the resurgence of the Panama Canal today and the justification with the Monroe Doctrine and all that, and Teddy Roosevelt. And that's what leads up to the section of the book, as we mentioned last time, of all of the regime changes and covert operations in other countries, all the way from the 1800s up to the present day. So he also admits that, as I've said, the Cold War really prepared us for the war on terror. For the CIA and for intelligence agencies, many of the failures, the great failures, are actually great successes, because the failures allow them to say, we need gigantic zillions of dollars more funding from your tax money because we failed. The only reason we failed is because you guys didn't give us enough taxes. So it's really just scams within scams. I'm not going to rehearse all this book. I'm just pointing to a lot of what we've talked about in the past. It all kind of ties together. He argues that the CFR was first really heavily involved in the Bogotazo revolution. That was the first directly CFR controlled operation, and that's why we get this connection between the CFR and Castro. It also doesn't really make sense either why, if the U.S. has Guantanamo Bay and Castro is this, big threat supposedly to U.S. economics and U.S., because the Soviets can put a missile there, right? All the stuff that we heard during the Cold War. Well, how easy would it be to take, right, Guantanamo Bay and use that as a base to take Cuba? It just doesn't seem plausible to me that Cuba is this legitimate threat that, if the U.S. really saw them as a threat, they could easily neutralize it. So I think a lot of these places allow these dictators to stay there. And other people like Che Guevara, who I don't agree with Che Guevara's philosophy, but he seems to have been at least more sincere than Castro was.